Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation for doing this meeting. I think this is a great opportunity to discuss these things. And in fact, that's the idea of this report to, get to talk about the future of Europe in Europe.
Okay, so one remark before what you see here is this little symbol. This is the symbol of something new we created at IFO. It is called Econ Europe. Econ Europe is a network of European research institutions, and I mention this because so this report is part of the work of this network, but there's a lot more going on. There's a website, so if you're interested, take a look at the website. The idea of Econ Europe is to bring economic research results into the policy debate, and also to bridge the national and European debates, the national and Brussels debates. This is something we believe is very interesting, because I'm sure many of you are aware that these two debates are often very separate and they are very different. And it happens to me, between so across member states, when you go, let's say, from Sweden. So on Monday I was in Prague, presented this report, and when you go from Prague to Stockholm, you're in very different places, and when you then go to Italy, which we will do next month, again, it's completely different. And the idea is, to bring these debates together and have a real European debate. And on this web page you find, short pieces of 300 words and a bit more on all kinds of European issues. So take a look. Okay, so every year we write this report, and this year the motivation was the fact that the EU is in a phase of crisis, some say in a phase of transition to something new. So we have Brexit, the EU, 1/5 of the EU in terms of economic weight will leave, which is quite a lot, and the balance of power in the EU will shift, the balance of influence, the balance of economic philosophies will shift, and so on. So there's a lot going on. We are now intensively discussing reform of the Eurozone, something I won't talk about today, but an important issue. And part of this debate is concern about diverging views within Europe, economic divergence, policy divergence, and so on. And I think one publication in this debate, which is very important, is the reflection paper of the European Commission on the future of the EU. So it used to be the case that the European Commission made proposals, said, we think the EU should do this. And now, for the first time, the Commission has done something different. The Commission has published a paper offering 5 models for the future of Europe, or 5 concepts for the future of Europe, and ask the member states and the citizens to discuss these models. And I personally think this was a very good idea in this difficult point in time, in this crisis situation, to say, okay, Europe is not something that happens from the center. The EU belongs to you, member states, or to the citizens. And now, please sit down and have, let's sit down and have a debate about where we want to go. Do we want, the so-called more Europe model, more centralization, less centralization, different clubs of countries in this EU? We should have an open debate about that. And I think, this is very useful. And in this group, we thought, now let's think about some of the issues that come up here. And what we normally do in this report is give a short macroeconomic outlook, and then have 3 chapters. Today I will focus mostly on chapter 4. Very briefly, chapter 2 is about building trust. I suppose many of you know the Elvis Presley song "Suspicious Minds," and the message of the song is, you can't build a future on suspicious minds. So there needs to be a minimum degree of trust, among people, but also among nations, to work together. So this is about trust, if you like, from an economic and economic policy perspective. The chapter number 3 is about different clubs of countries. So this question, should we have an EU where different groups of countries do different things together, or should it be, all in the same policy package? And as I said, 4 is about convergence, and today I will focus mostly on convergence. Very briefly on the other chapters. So the macroeconomic outlook is benign, is positive, as you're all aware. So here, you see the, just as one indicator among many, the IFO World Economic Survey. For a long time it was sort of, dodgy, and in the last 2 years it's been going up. So the macro outlook is positive. Here are the current growth forecasts. So we expect 2.2 for the EU. So we've now had, if you like, 5 years of growth rates close to 5%. So that's a positive development. Of course, these are average growth rates. As we will see, there's some heterogeneity behind that. But it's not such a bad economic situation. Unemployment rates are going down, even in the crisis countries. Quite interesting, Sweden here. Sweden, for the rest of the EU, has always been some kind of model country, with very positive connotations. Nevertheless, we have some countries now that have significantly lower unemployment rates, for instance. So that's certainly one issue to discuss here in Sweden. But overall, the picture is very, very positive. Just so we have this chapter on trust. I don't want to talk very much about it. Just a very brief look at what people say about trusting the EU. And what you see here is the level of trust in 2007, so 10 years ago, and the change in the level of trust. So that's the answer to the question, do you trust the EU? And this means very different things to different people, as always in surveys. And it's quite interesting. As you see here, trust in the EU in Great Britain was very low and didn't change much, declined slightly. More interesting, perhaps, this is Germany. So Germany is a country with very low trust in the EU and a decline in trust, although, in the last 10 years, economic development was very positive. And Sweden is up here. So again, low levels of trust compared to others in the EU, but at least not a decline in the last 10 years. And then, of course, you have, as you would expect, you have some countries like Greece, Spain. These are countries that have been hit very hard by the economic crisis. And when that happens, trust declines. By the way, not just in European institutions. If we looked at trust in national institutions, the picture would be very similar. Not always similar, but if things go bad economically, people lose trust in their own governments and the EU and basically everybody. Okay. In the next chapter, we talk a little bit about this club question. We discuss a number of issues here. What kind of club is the Eurozone? What kind of club is the Schengen Agreement? And one of the conclusions in this chapter is that clubs have organizing things in clubs has obvious advantages. So countries, it's economists, I guess, tend to like this. So you can, it's the idea countries have certain preferences, and an EU of different clubs allows them to join the clubs they like and stay out of the clubs that they don't like. Now, the difficulty with this concept is that you lose the opportunity of trading off different policies against one another. So basically, in the message of this chapter is, okay, these variables, this Europe à la carte, as some call it, has advantages, but it also has disadvantages. And one disadvantage is it's more difficult to do package deals. If you have more policies in the club, you can say, a country can say, okay, we lose on this dimension, we don't like this policy, but there are other policies we like, and then it's easier to stay together and give the club some stability than having all these different clubs. And of course there is interaction between the clubs. So if you, for instance, we experienced that in the migration crisis. If you're a member of a Schengen club, maybe you also need to be member of some kind of refugee quota club, because if you're not, people will just you need to reintroduce border controls. So these different clubs are obviously not independent. Okay, but let me now come to chapter 4. And chapter 4 is about economic convergence. Now, before I show you the numbers, I guess it's important to remind ourselves, first of all, what is convergence? We distinguish between what we call input and outcome convergence. So outcomes are, for instance, per capita income. That's what most people have in mind when they think about convergence, I guess. So the idea is, you know, if you have two countries, one is rich, one is poor, convergence means that the growth rate in the poorer country is higher than the growth rate in the richer country, so that the difference declines over time. This is convergence. Okay, and you can measure this in different ways, as we describe in the report, but that's the idea of convergence. And we call this outcome convergence. It's about outcomes. Something we, you know, another outcome is unemployment, then we have nominal convergence, inflation rates, debt levels, and so on. These are all outcomes. And then you can look at input convergence. So input convergence would be, the convergence in economic policies. So we all do the same economic policies. That's another form of convergence. And one thing we emphasize in this report is that outcome convergence is a political objective of the EU. It's quite clear. Income convergence is, and you know, there's not much to say against outcome convergence apart from the fact that it doesn't happen easily. You know, it's hard to achieve. But you know, economically, I guess there's nothing to say against the idea that, you know, you should have some convergence of per capita income. But if you can now for input convergence, it's different. The one philosophy that would support the idea of having, you know, wanting to have input convergence, convergence in economic policies, is to say we want something like a level playing field. So in Europe, you know, we want to have similar economic policies because we don't want different economic policies, for instance, to distort competition. That's one view of input convergence, but it's not necessarily the right view. Another way of looking at this would be to say, okay, countries are different. They, you know, in order to be able to trade successfully, countries need to be different. And if countries are different, they will also need different economic policies. So one example, for instance, would be if you have one country that is specialized in, you know, industrial products with very steady demand, so it's the same throughout the year. You know, in such a country, the let's say labor market institutions, unemployment insurance will be different compared to a country where you have very cyclical industries. You know, for instance, tourism. You know, so with one season, so everybody is working in tourism in the summer, and then in the winter you get other things. So you can imagine you need different labor market institutions in that kind of environment. You can have different preferences, of course. And that's why we say, you know, outcome convergence is more plausible than input convergence. So let's start and take a look at outcome convergence. So this is on the vertical axis, you have income growth between 1995 and 2007. So by how much has income changed? And here you have the level of income in 1995. Okay. So here on the left, you have countries that were poor in 1995, and if they are up here, it means they have been growing a lot. Okay, and here you have rich countries that were rich in 1995, and if they have been growing less than these countries, if they are lower here, you have convergence. Okay, so if there is convergence in per capita income, you see a declining slope here. Does that make sense? Okay, so here we have the poor countries that have been growing a lot, and here we have the rich countries. They have been growing less, and that's why the poor countries have been able to catch up with the rich. So, you know, in a way, this falling curve here is good news. That's what we want to see. You know, the poor countries catching up. Now, if you look at this graph, what's striking is that you see kind of two clusters here. So you have a group of countries up here, and then you have a group of countries down here. Okay, and this is important because so this is the EU 28. If you focus on the EU 15, so you take away the Middle and Eastern European countries that joined the EU in 2004, more or less, you see this. There is no convergence. Okay, so the curve is flat. We have no convergence. So the poor countries have not been growing faster than the rich countries in between 1995 and 2017. And you know, I guess that's the overall picture. If you look at the EU 28, there is convergence, but convergence is driven by the countries of Middle and Eastern Europe. They've been catching up. They've been the poorest. They've been catching up. If you look at the EU 15, the convergence issue is about convergence between, let's say, the North and the South. And there was convergence, if you look at the data, until the 1990s, and then it stopped. It didn't stop in the financial crisis. It stopped long before. And the most drastic case is Italy. If you look at Italy, you see that economic growth, growth of labor productivity stopped in the 1990s. It's very interesting. You know, labor productivity growth in Italy was as in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, for 2 decades before 1990, and then it stops. And nobody knows why. You know, there are many theories about why this happened. I was in Rome a few months ago and gave a presentation, and I call this the Italian question. For me, this is the most important question for Italian economic policy. It's not about, you know, short-term fiscal policy. It's all irrelevant. You know, there is a deep structural issue. This, you know, stop of labor productivity growth in Italy, and after the presentation, you know, at least, you know, 8 people talked to me and came up with different theories. Everybody was saying, don't you know why this happened? It happened because, you know, something in the schooling system, because of China, because of the euro, because there are all kinds of theories why this happened, but, you know, it's very great. Okay, and that's what's driving this lack of convergence. Another way of looking at this is this graph. So what you see here is per capita income in percent of per capita income of the North. And you see, you know, there's even slight divergence in the South and some catching up of Eastern Europe. Now let's take a brief look at, so this was outcome. Let's take a brief look at inputs. Input convergence, and what we do in the report is look at a number of indicators of institutional quality. This is not easy because, you know, what is institutional quality? As I just said, the same institutions are not necessarily good for all countries. Okay, so different countries may need different institutions. So it certainly is problematic, but taking that into account, if you look at indicators of institutional quality, one is, you know, the Economic Freedom Heritage Foundation Index. You know, that has its problems, but anyway. Another would be corruption. What's the degree of corruption, and yet another would be doing business indicators. And what you see here is mostly divergence, like here. You know, you see that the North, you know, is improving here. The South is stagnating, but it's, you know, for corruption it's the same. So institutions are not improving in Southern Europe. They are actually getting worse in many dimensions, but not in all dimensions. If you look at the doing business indicator, for instance, you know, you do have convergence, something we like to see. You do have some convergence, so it's not completely negative, but it's not. You know, there is some divergence here. Okay, so we do have you know, some convergence, but in particular when it comes to Southern Europe, a high degree of divergence. So what does the EU do about that? One instrument is the EU budget, and what's going on in the EU budget, very roughly, is that convergence, or trying to achieve convergence, is gaining importance. Agricultural subsidies are going down. Regional and structural policies are gaining importance. Here is the redistributive effect. This is the net balances, so, you know, the relevance of this indicator is subject to debate. But overall, the picture is, I guess, you know, the rich countries pay, including Sweden, and the poor country receive partly quite a lot of money, as you see. You know, it's going up to 4% of GNI. That's quite a lot of money. Okay, so, you know, money is flowing from the rich to the poor countries. How effective is the use of this money? That's subject to debate. What we write in the report is that the evaluation, in particular, the evaluation published by the European Commission, is unconvincing. Maybe we discuss this. This is a technical but a very important question. At a conference, this was really striking, at a conference 2 years ago in Brussels about the budget, the commissioner said, we convert, with our regional policy, we convert €1 into 11. I found that quite striking. I think it's wrong, but maybe that's obvious. But it's not something the Commission writes. But it's that kind of statement isn't quite appropriate. The other instrument next to regional policy is the European semester. And here you see some numbers about what countries do with it. This is an exchange of views between countries. This is a dialogue, not more. It's not binding. It's just a relatively complicated process of dialogue, and these are numbers published by the Commission. So not very much is implemented. But this is obviously another instrument to bring about convergence, to discuss, what are the right policies for countries and so on. So let me conclude with some recommendations from the report. So first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that economic integration doesn't automatically imply income and policy convergence. So there are some economic theories suggesting that this happens, but there are other theories suggesting it won't happen, and we see empirically it isn't happening. It's happening sometimes, but not always. Output convergence, as I said, is desirable. Input convergence, not necessarily. It may even be counterproductive. And this point is important, I think. We need to be aware, if we look at the policy instruments the EU has at the EU level, I mean, the member states are the EU, but as well. But if we focus on what's going on at the EU level, I think it is important to be aware of the fact that the EU doesn't have the instruments to bring about convergence, because whether a country converges depends on the policies of the member states. Economic and fiscal policy, 95% of it is done by the national government. It's a national competence, and that means it is primarily a responsibility of the member states to bring about convergence. Not, the EU can't deliver on this, and sometimes the public debate suggests that convergence is something like a promise. The EU promises convergence, and I think that's very dangerous because if you promise something and you don't deliver, you undermine trust. People blame you for not achieving what you should achieve, for being inefficient, and I think we should be clear. The EU offers opportunities. But it cannot promise convergence. It doesn't have the instruments, and it shouldn't promise convergence. I think promising things like we will be the most competitive and converging area of the world economy, it's not really helpful, because it doesn't work. It hasn't worked in the past. It won't work easily. It's nice to try, but I think it's important to have have it very clear who is responsible for convergence, and the responsibility is with the member states. Coordination, there are spillovers. Coordination is useful. I think that the European semester is useful, but again, it is no guarantee for convergence. The prime responsibility comes from the member states. Thank you.
The best thing of having a seminar in an academic environment is actually that some premises or axioms might even be questioned. And I was speaking with Professor Calmfors yesterday about his remarks. I was promised actually that he would at least question one of the premises, if outcome convergence is desirable or not. So let's start there and then we can move on. It won't be too much of an academic debate, I hope, but it will be interesting to see whether we can even question one of your axiomatic pillars. And there we are. So please, Professor Calmfors.
Yes, thanks then first for the opportunity to comment the report. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I was a member of the EEAG group for a long time, so I'm very glad to see that the group is still alive and writing interesting reports. So I'll focus on this chapter 4, as you did in your presentation, but make some very general and basic reflections. So economic convergence is a stated objective of the European Union, and that is what you discuss. You discuss, when we look at output convergence, you discuss a number of dimensions. There are other dimensions that you don't discuss, but that we could also discuss. But I want to ask this very basic question. Why should economic convergence be an objective of the EU in the first place? I think this is a question which is difficult to discuss in general, because it depends on exactly what type of convergence that we are discussing. But if I start with the variables that you stressed, output convergence, per capita income, employment, unemployment, you also discuss national income inequality. I just can't see any compelling reason why it would be desirable for different EU states to have the same per capita income levels or the same employment or unemployment rates. It's desirable, of course, to raise income levels. It's desirable to have high employment, low unemployment. But it's not obvious to me why, in general, it should be welfare increasing per se to converge to the same levels. In a national context, there we have an insurance argument, for example, when it comes to wage distribution, an argument for wage equalization. And it's an insurance argument that individuals don't know ex ante where you will end up, with how incomes you will end up, and therefore it's good, sort of, you get a higher expected income ex ante if you have a compressed wage structure. But I don't see really how you can extend this argument to the European level. I mean, and it should be an argument where, in which country do you end up in the end? But that can't be an important argument. If I try to find one argument, then I think it would be that convergence in these output variables, outcome variables, would help foster a European identity, in the sense that sort of more similar policies would be preferred among countries if they have about the same economic outcomes. And this could then facilitate coordination of policy in areas where there would be welfare gains from coordination. Those areas you stress because of externalities or large spillover effects, which would then be taken into account. So that could be possibly an argument. But then you should state clearly that this is the argument. But even then, whether convergence is desirable should depend upon exactly how is it achieved. Okay, if countries learn from each other about appropriate policies, that's all good. But if you achieve convergence by forcing a country to make another trade-off between, say, employment and social insurance than according to national preferences, then you don't get that effect. And if you achieve convergence in say, per capita incomes through fiscal transfers, that's a sort of two-edged sword. It could create, of course, resentment in member states that feel that they have to pay up too much. Okay, then I think it's different when we come to variables that you don't discuss, as fiscal balance and government debt. There, I don't see any case for convergence, but I see a case for rules on maximum government debt or maximum deficit debt, as we do have. And that's to reduce the risks for other EU countries that they will have to bail out crisis countries, as has occurred then in the euro area. Then one specific area where convergence is desirable, of course, that's synchronization of business cycles in the euro area, not in the whole EU, but in the euro area. Because, I mean, this is unambiguously good because it makes the common monetary policy more likely to suit everyone. We've had the discussion of whether common monetary policy would lead to more synchronization of business cycles, because we get larger trade flows that will transmit cyclical shocks between countries more, and because domestic monetary policy is no longer there as a potential disturbance. And you say something about this, that this may be occurring over the long term, but we also know that the initial effect of the monetary union, that was a huge fall in interest rates in the Eurozone periphery, when currency risk was eliminated. And that led to very asymmetric booms in those countries. That later caused the euro crisis. I like your distinction between output and input convergence. And so far I have talked about output convergence. But I agree with you that the case for input convergence is much weaker. I think the case for output convergence is also weak, but it's even weaker for input convergence. And there are several reasons for this. First one is we have very incomplete knowledge of, say, which reforms are most efficient for raising employment. And I think for this reason it's a very bad idea to make countries follow the same policy strategies. It's better to have system competition and learning from different policies in different countries. Second reason is that preferences may differ between countries, so different countries may want to make different trade-offs between various policy objectives, between efficiency and equity, say high employment and income dispersion. Third reason is that there may be several ways of achieving a given policy objective, high employment. So different policy combinations could give the same outcome. To take an example, we have the Anglo-Saxon model, decentralized wage sector, small welfare state, that gives high employment. But also the Nordic model, large welfare state, in-work benefits, coordinated wage bargaining, seems to do the same thing. And that we shouldn't try to restrict. Another aspect has to do with institutions rather than policies. Here I think that the EU can play a constructive role in contributing to specific national institutions. We have rules on fiscal councils, on independent central banks, also on an independent judiciary. And sort of to have minimum, not convergence, but minimum rules there can be very effective. And in most cases, less controversial than convergence or rules on policies. Although we know from the Polish case that an independent judiciary can also be quite controversial, but hopefully this is an exception. Final point concerns coordination and centralization of policies. I think we should distinguish between these two concepts. Coordination in this case is to me when different member states sort of negotiate and they reach cooperative solutions. Centralization is when the decision-making power is delegated to a supranational European body. So let me take two examples. The banking union, that's an example of centralization with supervision delegated then to the ECB single supervisory board, resolution decisions to a large extent to the single resolution board. This is, I think, a good area for centralized decisions because banking crises have strong spillover effects on other member states and decisions have to be swift when there is a crisis. You can't await bargaining between states. Coordination. Yeah, an example which you don't discuss, the distribution of refugee immigrants within the EU. Very contentious issue, as we all know. Strong externalities here, sort of when we have non-cooperative behavior. Individual countries don't take into account that restrictive national rules will sort of transmit the problem instead to other countries. Strong argument there for cooperative solutions, but very hard to achieve because preferences among member states have been so diverse, so we haven't reached any cooperative solutions. This could be seen as an argument then for centralized decisions instead, sort of moving these decisions to a higher level in the form of binding quotas for everyone. But again, this really is a dilemma because it would force admission of refugees or member states that are very opposed to it. We may not like it, but that's the case. And if that happens, there will be more resentment in these countries against the EU. On the other hand, without some kind of centralized solution, there will be resentment in those member states who feel they bear a lot of the burden. I mean, we have Italy, we have Greece, but we also have Germany, Sweden, which have taken a large part of the burden. So this is really a conundrum, which it's very hard to see how it can be solved. I wish that I had a solution, but I have not, so I will end there. Okay.
then let's move to the. We'll keep this in mind, and while we just reorganize the furniture and invite Ms. Areskough for her remarks, could we just put off the screen so we don't have need to have it in our eyes? And well, why don't we all sit and listen as well? Then we can move to the panel. Yeah, so you'll be alone.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Please.
And thank you for this opportunity to comment on a very interesting report. Congratulations to the report. I think it's extremely important, as you said, that we have this kind of analysis and discussions, because it's very important policy choices we have for the future, and bridging the EU bubble, so to say, with the national context are very important, and that's also what we try to do in the white paper you alluded to. I was thinking my comments will mostly focus on what the EU Commission is doing to after the learning process of the economic and financial crisis. And but first, maybe just two general comments on the issue of convergence. I mean, it's true that in the treaty we have, as you commented also in the report, the objective to bridge or to diminish the regional differences between in the member states, to have to strive towards a convergence in that sense, especially for the least favored regions. But I would not argue that you could read from the treaty that we should have economic convergence in all fields, because it's and you can see that from our tools also, that we vary from trying to centralize in the banking union, in the financial union. We have tools for centralization. We have very much coordination goals within the economic semester, and then we have other tools also for convergence, but that's more within the monetary policy fields, and also when it comes to inflation and so on. So I would say there are different objectives, but these have of course never been defined as is usual within the union. You have this constructive ambiguity, exactly what do we mean with economic convergence, and this is also a learning process, I would very much say, also referring to the chapter on trust. I think how you achieve centralization, coordination on convergence is very much a learning process, and during the crisis we've seen how these tools have been developed, and it's very much a question of trust also between member states, as you said. In order to impose more conditionality or convergence, you would need to build trust between member states. So, what is the Commission's policy right now? Why do we think we need to take more action? Well, there's been quite a lot of developments, both on the Capital Markets Union, on the Banking Union, but we also came in December with the 6th of December, a package on the EMU deepening. And I will first comment on the issues that you take up in the report, where we see need for improvement, the budget, the semester, and the social pillar. And then comment on some fields that you don't discuss, but I think which have been quite effective tools for convergence or similar economic policies. But on the budget, I would argue that the structural funds and the EU budget have not been made conditional on the economic policy, and that therefore the effectiveness have not been, how do you say, measured or imposed on member states. It has been a question again of sovereignty and common policies, and it has very much been left for the member states to themselves decide how to use their structural funds. But now this is something we are also seeing that there are room for improvements, and in the December package we actually now suggest that we would link the European semester, our recommendations for economic policy, with the structural funds. So a certain part of the structural funds you would only receive if you follow up the recommendations in the semester. And this is a pilot now between 2018 and 2020, but if it turns out well, we would see this for the next budget period, or at least we will suggest from the Commission that it will be a much stronger link, and also a question of conditionality between the structural funds. So there we agree there can be a better made use of the structural funds, but the member states will have to agree that this is a good idea, again, a balance. When it comes to European semester, we think certainly that it has had effect. If you compare to the case if you didn't have these recommendations, I think it varies between member states how seriously they are taken. But I mean, in Sweden they are discussed in the parliament and commented upon by the government. So you have a real discussion about the recommendations that the Commission is issuing. And we had actually on Wednesday we had a seminar. My colleagues from the presentation here was leading, and the government then said that the Commission's analysis in this country report, which is the basis for the recommendations, are better than the IMF and the OECD. So the stronger, I think the analysis have developed over the years. It's now providing a good economic policy tool. We have also streamlined it. We have fewer recommendations than before within the European semester, which means it's also becoming more effective. And I think the dialogue between member states and the Commission, member states are always asked to comment on our recommendations, on our country report, and that's also important for the ownership, of course. But as I said, semester will be linked stronger to the EU budget in the future. So there you will hopefully also see more effectiveness. Also wanted to comment on the social pillar, and you're saying not sure that this is the right area where member states should come together and have the same policies. I don't think that's what we from the Commission side aim at either, because we say there should be no change in the competence. This social pillar, that was agreed in November in Gothenburg, is 20 rights and principles. But we say there's no change in competence, so what is member states' competence should be decided on member state level, and what is in the treaty is common competence should remain. So not a move that Brussels should start to decide and uniform all social policies. But what we do see, and this is maybe the personal remark, is maybe the biggest challenge for the EU or globally in the future. We see these increasing gaps in society, increasing inequalities, and that is which are giving rise to all sorts of effects. Of course, people being left out, but it's also leading to movements, anti-establishment, anti-democracy, anti-political parties. So it's an extremely important challenge, and it's a consequence of globalization, of digitalization, of integration. And even if the, so to say, remedy against this, because I agree, countries will always remain different in these fields, these are challenges that we believe must be discussed on a European level because they're so systemic and so important. So it would be very negligent of us not to take these challenges seriously. And then we don't say now, okay, now we should all have the same kind of answers to these questions, but we should at least discuss it, and there might be some best practices that we can learn from each other. Then what you don't mention, which are also important instruments to economic convergence or economic reform and coordination, is actually during the crisis we decided to establish the ESM and giving loans to countries like Cyprus, Spain and Greece. And these forced upon countries economic structural reforms that were very important. So I would say that was very efficient as well. We also, as Professor Calmfors were commenting, we also have a lot have happened on the banking union and also less on the capital markets union, but there we are now trying to create the European capital markets union will also lead to more economic convergence. On the banking union, there's a very strong case for more centralization, and we are now hoping for this European deposit insurance scheme that we have proposed, that will be hopefully during this year, as well as the fiscal backstop that will put into place, which also are building a ground for more financial and economic convergence. Also during the crisis, the European semester are mostly recommendations for member states to undertake structural reforms, but we did agree on a 2-pack, on a 6-pack that also made the European semester stronger when it comes to macroeconomic imbalances. That we didn't have in the European semester before. So now Sweden is actually one of the countries that are being looked upon because of the housing market on the macroeconomic imbalance procedure. So there was to make the semester a little bit more efficient. And there also, when it comes to fiscal policy and macroeconomic policy within the semester, there are possibility for sanctions for Euro member states. So it has made it a little bit sharper as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please. Let's start with some comments to what has been remarked by Professor. First, I was asked by Professor Clemens, will you give? I would like you to give the remarks on the Professor Fuest's comment and Professor Clemens, what's the difference? Well, those are the tricks of the trade of a moderator. I actually thought that since some of the issues from the report and also some general, even principal issues were brought up, that Professor Fuest would at least comment on a couple of the remarks made. Remarks are prepared, comments have to be spontaneous, I thought. So please go ahead. Would you like to sit? Should we bring some chairs to you? Or do you feel young enough to stay? Great.
What is that?
Standing up. Right.
Well, yes, thank you. I mean, these are very thoughtful remarks. Of course, there is this fundamental question, does it make sense to have convergence? And I think that's the point you made. That's what your starting point. And you said, well, in the treaties, it's not so clear. So the treaties don't say we want the convergence of per capita income. You're right. The treaty says we have some, we should look at the least favored regions, not countries, and do something about these regions. And these are different objectives. At the same time, I think what a lot of people have in mind is really convergence of general, standards of living, and there's the expectation and sometimes also the promises made that if you're in the EU, there is a hope of getting to this convergence. But I agree it's not quite clear, and economically, I would agree completely. It's very hard to say people should converge in terms of per capita income. And as an economist, you would say, there are people who have preferences for leisure, so they don't work much. They choose low income levels, and they prefer, it's sort of the Northern European cliche is that, in Southern Europe you have more people who prefer to sit, spend the day at the beach and, not work, and have low levels of consumption of goods and a high level of consumption of people. So, I think they're totally right. In the report, we didn't question this convergence issue. We didn't very much emphasize, we need it. We just said, it's there, it's an objective.
and let's see how it goes. So what I think is more important is this question about input convergence. You know, I totally agree to what you said in particular, and I think that's a very fundamental question. I mean, you said the right economic policy, the right structural reforms do not exist. Whereas a lot of the European model of policy coordination is based on the assumption that there is some, I don't know who actually, some European elite says, now this is the right economic policy. You should do these structural reforms. So we write down, in the European semester, we write down a country report and we send it to you, and you please implement it. And that is a tension. As an economist, I guess we would say, no, there is no optimal policy. Countries should choose their policies, and if they choose a policy that makes them poor, it is their right, and they should bear the consequence of being poor. And they just shouldn't make other people to pay for it. Okay, so and that is in strong tension with things like the ESM, where the perception in many of these countries is we have abolished democracy in Europe and replaced it by the dictatorship of some technocratic organization consisting of people from the Commission, basically the Troika, maybe plus some people from Berlin undercover, walking around and imposing austerity. And that is very, this is a tension. So the other extreme would be to say, what national parliaments decide is right. So, if there is a guy like Tsipras or Varoufakis who, has very wild suggestions, it's their choice. Please, you have to pay for it, but you do it. I don't know if that is the ideal approach either. But, I think there is a very strong tension among these two, models. And I have to say I'm a bit skeptical, maybe more than most policymakers in Europe. I'm a bit skeptical regarding this, technocratic model. We know what the right structural reforms are, and that's, I think the entire debate about monetary union and the crisis countries is based on this idea, if you implement the right structural reforms, you will be fine, and the things will go well. And that's probably not true. So there are different ways of approaches to economic policies, and I think it's not possible to say this is the right policy.
Would you like to comment on that? Yes.
Yeah, two comments. I mean, I think one has entered the wrong track with the ESM and the bailout funds. It would be better to restore the no bailout clause than sort of the problem that we have imposed policies. So you have to, not we, you in Germany, has to impose policies on others who wouldn't be there to the same extent. Second comment, something we touched upon, but I think we should discuss more. I think that the most important convergence issue, that's a need for a convergence of the debate in different countries. And I think you were, Katarina, was too optimistic. I think we have sort of formal processes for how to take into account views from the EU or various parts of or various organizations in the EU. But that's only formally. I mean, the debate is national, and what the EU has said doesn't really play any part in the election campaigns or in Sweden or the public debate. And this is a very difficult issue. I think it is difficult, but I think part of the problem is that decision-making in the EU is so complex, so it's very hard for ordinary people to follow what's going on. And even if you're an expert, I mean, I worked with various EU issues, but I do it every now and then. So if it goes a few months and you haven't thought about it, then sort of lots of new things have happened. It's not easy to sort of follow exactly what is happening. So it's complex decision making. It's very complex and many processes. Even if you take one area with fiscal policy rules, there are so many rules and so many processes, and they are not always consistent with each other. So it would at least be helpful for sort of getting the European and the national debates closer to each other if one could simplify this whole framework. How this is going to be achieved, that I don't know, and you don't know either.
Well, I guess you have to answer that, even if you seem to agree that you don't know it either.
No, exactly. No, just to remarks on that, I didn't want to sound too optimistic on the debate between national and EU level. That I meant on the economic recommendations, at least, and where I know in Sweden the context best, that there is a productive dialogue. I think the government would agree with that, between the Commission and the government when we write our country report and our recommendations, that it's a useful dialogue. But I completely agree with you on the bigger issue, that there is no discussion about EU policies in society in general, and that's what we are fighting for. Our little office here in Sweden every day. We're trying to, on social media, we're arranging seminars, we're traveling in the country, trying to trigger the debate, positive and negative, about what the EU does, as long as we have a debate. But we see that the media is not taking it up, and the political parties are not taking it up. We have an election now in September, and we don't really know what the political parties think about different important EU policy areas.
But also, I mean, policy recommendations from the EU don't play an important role either. I mean, if we take, for instance, housing prices. I mean, this debate, we have this debate, it's a problem, but it's not because the EU says it's a problem.
No,
it's because
no.
Of
course, yeah. Okay.
I was actually one of the campaign leaders for the Swedish referendum on joining the EU on the 13th of November 1994 when the referendum was won. Don't make me regret what I have done. Before we move into questions and comments from the room, I would like to ask you at least one question by my own. And Professor Fuest, you said that EU does not have the instruments to bring about convergence. Should it have it? Would it be desirable if it had it? I guess your answer would be no, considering what you just said before. But if I ask this question to all of you in a straightforward manner.
Well, I guess maybe this question is a bit academic because I mean, currently, democratic legitimacy of economic policy is at the member state level. And that means, whatever happens in the EU must go in terms of economic and fiscal policy, and these things must, should primarily be decided at the national level. So it would be very hard to think about a setup where you would have the instruments to really bring about convergence. We should remind ourselves that many member states have a convergence issue within the country. Germany has the East-West.
The question could be posed as: could it even be possible to create these instruments?
So the experience is it's very hard to bring about convergence. If you look at East and Western Germany, the Western Germany has put so much money into Eastern Germany, and there is no convergence. Maybe because we have put so much money in there. So generally, this is very difficult to bring about, but it's not entirely hopeless, because we have countries like, maybe a special case, Ireland, where the country was poor and has converged very dramatically. So it sometimes works, but it's very hard to bring this about from the center. Maybe just one remark, if I may, about the European Monetary Union and deposit insurance. So here I'm really worried. Because I think if you think about European deposit insurance, it is quite clear that to make that possible, you need different things. At least three, I would say. Bring down non-performing loans. That's a massive issue, but not even the most important one. You need to get the banks out of financing governments. Get government bonds out of the banks. 30% of Italian debt is nowadays in the hands of Italian banks. If we get there, we would make the Eurozone different from all other countries in the world, where you have a central fiscal authority and governments, banks can hold government bonds. But if we don't,
Imagine, for instance, we had deposit insurance in 2015 in the Greek crisis. The Greek government could have sold bonds to its own banks, write off the bonds, and get the money back from deposit insurance. It's impossible. So I don't see one European government which is willing to give up the right to sell government bonds with zero equity underpinning. This is not discussed by the Commission, and this is grave. And the third issue is bankruptcy legislation. We need to be able to seize a house. The bank needs to be able to seize the house. It's a very long way. So for the next 10 years, I cannot imagine the common deposit insurance. And I remember, that's the last remark about this.
Yeah, I will interrupt you there.
So just one sentence. A Swedish deputy prime minister, has told me several times, if you do European unemployment insurance or deposit insurance, we will never join the euro. And I think that's a problem, because the rich countries, if we do these things and don't do them well, the rich countries will never join. And the poor countries will join, like Bulgaria and so on, because they think they will.
Which of the deputies was that? Who have this insight?
It's a very smart woman, I've forgotten her name, but she's still there.
Now, any other takers on my question about should or could the EU have instruments for convergence? Please, we can go this way.
I think it depends on which area you're talking about. I mean, if you have fiscal policy, we have a stability and growth pact there. We'll have very clear rules where we want at least not exact convergence, but within thresholds where you should be. I think that's all agree that that's desirable. But then I think for other areas of economic policy...
But that's input convergence. Now we are speaking about...
Yeah, output convergence...
Could we create output convergence?
I think there, I don't think we... there you agree on what is good economic policy. We don't say identical policies, but the overarching aim is to create jobs and growth and have financial stability. So that's the goals, not identical economic convergence in all fields.
Yeah. No, but that follows from what I said. I mean, if we're talking about convergence in income levels, I don't think that is an important objective. So for that reason, I don't see the need for such instruments.
But could they be developed, theoretically?
Very theoretically. Yeah. No, but let me get back to the question whether it's desirable or not. I think within a nation, I mean, Germany, western parts and eastern parts, or Italy, northern and southern parts, for the cohesion of a nation, I think it's important not to have too large income disparities. But I mean, are Greeks or Estonians, I mean, are they more unhappy because they have a lower income than we have in Sweden?
Yes.
I mean, they are, no, I would say that maybe they are unhappy because they have low incomes. But I don't think it's a big issue to converge in income levels with Sweden. So it's not the same when we discuss that at the European level.
Well, as you see, the audience is keen on entering the discussion, and two persons have already put themselves on my list. Mr. Jeppsson, please. I know your name, but you might state your full name.
Hans Jeppsson. I was for a single year Secretary of State for Foreign Trade. I think you cannot discuss...
2 minutes.
Yes. Convergence necessarily is linked to security policy. The inclusion of Italy in 1956 was to diffuse the Communist Party influence. The Southern European countries were included to diffuse possible socialism and communism after the fall of fascism. Eastern Europe, some of us remember the debate in the 1990s whether the cordon sanitaire should be wide or small, and the conclusion was a large number of East European countries. That is about security policy. The consequence of inclusion without conversion is the tragic consequence of Brexit. It comes by the inflow of immigrants from Bulgaria, Romania, also earlier on from Poland and Lithuania, which stems from the great differences in income between the Eastern European countries and the Western European countries. We cannot have an open labour market with these income differences unless there is at least a prospect of a quick economic growth in Eastern Europe. So as I see it, we either have to continue on some kind of output convergence, although I agree with you that it's not necessarily a good policy. But as long as we have the open labour market, we need to do something. The alternative is to say, well, we divide Europe into a couple of zones where the labour movement is somehow restricted. And I think that is a question that we have to bring up in this. Otherwise, I largely agree with you on your conclusions about the difficulty of bringing about convergence and the difficulty of really influencing national policy through the European semester, although it's, I think, 90% of the recommendations are wise and sound.
Thank you. Let's move on to some more remarks and questions, and then we can get back to the panelists. Please.
Michael Sullman. I have a question to Professor Fuest. When you read the Koalitionsvertrag, there's a lot, this chapter about first chapter about cooperation in Europe, lots of positive sums, but at the same time, diplomatically worded, there's some red lines. Now, the present discussion between France and Germany, which is supposed to deliver some kind of grand new plan, how do you view that, the thrust of these discussions at present, in the light of your analysis here in the report? I mean, the French position is huge quantities of more input convergence, as I read.
Morten Blix here at IFN. I wanted to ask about complexity. Lars brought it up, but I would like to see the panel's thoughts on that in the context of this broader issues about trust in institutions and trust in the EU. I mean, there's a feeling in which if you don't understand something, whatever it is, it's hard to trust it. And there has been an overall sort of tendency towards increasing complexity in a lot of areas in the EU. Just let me give two examples. One is in the fiscal sphere. We used to have the Stability and Growth Pact, so 60% debt, 3% maximum deficit. We moved away. We heard the term macroeconomic imbalance procedure. That's one of the jargons that's used. Another one is the fiscal compact. And these things are rather complicated. I would sort of be a bit provocative and say that there might not be 5 persons in Sweden that can explain the whole way that this is together. And I used to be one of those when I was at the Ministry of Finance, but not anymore. So this is very difficult to explain. And another example is the banking union, for example, and macroprudential policies. All of these areas are becoming very technical, very difficult, and from the outside perspective, almost incomprehensible. So is this a worry for how we build trust and the direction that we take?
Thank you. Shall we move into, there was a direct question to you, Professor, from Mr. Solman. We could maybe answer that first and then move back to Mr. Jeppsson's issue of labour market and income difficulties, and then come back to the complexity. Please, yes.
Oh, okay. Do you want to?
No, you can.
No.
Okay. So the Europe chapter and the coalition contract. I have to say I was very unhappy about this chapter for a number of reasons. So one sentence in the chapter says Germany wants to pay more into the EU budget. I don't want to say that this sentence is stupid, but I think it is unreasonable and irresponsible. I mean, it is the responsibility of the German government to
spend the taxpayers' money carefully. Okay, so if you say we want to pay more into the budget, you stop something that is very necessary, is thinking about the money we have. Of course, you know, the UK is leaving, there's less money, so I think this is an opportunity to think about how we spend the money. Maybe we should spend it differently. I think there are ways of improving that. If, you know, if a country like Germany says, you know, we'll pay more, everybody says wonderful, so we don't have to think about you know, changing the spending. The second effect is that other countries would immediately say, well, that's great. If they pay more, we pay less. The Dutch government has said that, and this has also been the reaction of the Austrian government. So, you know, this is very costly. It was an abuse by individual politicians to increase their profile. That's why it was said, and that's why it's highly irresponsible if you think about the national, and I think also the European interest. Now, another aspect of this chapter was the idea to give a positive signal to Emmanuel Macron, and I think that is right. You know, there is a perception in Germany that we need to support this government because if we don't, next time we get Le Pen. That's you know, that's very strong motivation, and I think that's fine. Now, the interesting thing about Macron is that he has made some proposals, you know, about a European finance minister or a European budget. I think none of these proposals will solve the problem of the Eurozone. I think a European finance minister would be counterproductive even, because this would be, you know, there would be high expectations, it would be a big promise, and this poor guy wouldn't be able to do much because, you know, he has no democratic legitimacy, or she. So, you know, I think that's dangerous, but I think what's good is some openness for, you know, debate. And Macron himself, you know, he once said, you know, I have no red lines, I only have horizons. And what this means is, you know, I'm aware that we need reforms, in particular in the Eurozone, and I'm open to debate. And I think, you know, that's sort of the positive side about it. So, you know, there will be, I think, debates that are more open. There has never been a French government and president who understood Germany so well as the current one. If you look at the finance minister and so on, it doesn't mean they share the German views or the Germans share the French views, but no, I think there is an opportunity here about it.
No, I wanted to address the issue of complexity, and I completely agree with you. I mean, there was many, the six-pack, the two-pack, the financial compact, all of those were taken very quickly in a very urgent situation during the crisis, so they were not maybe the most pedagogic instruments, but I would still say that you have to remember these are rules, it's one framework of rules instead of 28 different ones. So it replaces, instead of we have this diversity of 28 different rules for these kind of issues, you have one. So I would just say that like in the single market, it's still a simplification in that level. And then I would say that maybe not 5% of Swedes either exactly understand how the Swedish budget is national budget is structured. So these are, per definition, complex issues. I would also say, maybe to change a little bit the debate. Can I add another? Can I come back?
Could we come back to the
Yes,
questions, and then you might also maybe spare to the final remarks if you wish to.
Yeah.
But what about the issue of a more variable geometry of the labor market, or as a trade-off, more policies of convergence? Would you like to address that?
I don't know what I will be answering, but I know what I want to say.
That's one of the things I usually learn out here at the IFN in our media trainings.
First about Morten's question, the complexity. I mean, this is a huge problem. I've heard this about 5 persons understanding the EU fiscal rules.
I think Martin Blix is a bit humble.
I thought I was one of the 5. But I always wondered who were the other 4. But I mean, the problem is if you study these issues, analyze them sort of intently, I mean every now and then, but you don't follow it all the time, and then you enter into a discussion with EU civil servants, you always feel like an idiot because sort of new concepts, new terminology and you don't know exactly what's been going on since you studied it the last time. Mr. Jeppson's question, I think this was very well phrased. What you're saying is that immigration, also labor immigration, is a huge problem, and probably major reason behind Brexit, that there is a lot of resentment. And then you're saying that this depends upon the differences in per capita incomes between different parts of the European Union. I think this is one of the better, or maybe best argument I've heard for convergence in that sense. I've been thinking about this myself. I wrote a column in Dagens Nyheter where I instead took up the idea that maybe we need some limitations on mobility, because otherwise we will get this negative reaction, at least for now. So in order to make sort of the EU survive to see a better day, then we might have to sort of backtrack on mobility of labor. So that would be another idea. Now, of course, this kind of convergence between the Eastern European countries and Western European countries, it will happen. I mean, even without the European Union. I mean, it's something we know from growth theory, that there's a very strong catching up effect, that countries with a lower, at least if you have similar institutions, you save about as much, then you get this kind of convergence without, I mean, it's basic economic forces that are much more important than whether you have some structural funds that sort of standard some
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you put the finger on sort of something very important. So I should have included that in my remarks, not comments.
No.
So it is an important aspect, yes.
Two more comments from the auditorium. Please go ahead, and then Professor Lindberg.
From University. I have maybe missed something you did mention, but you cannot mention everything, you know. But that's a little bit in my feeling, more conversion when it comes to positioning the EU and its views. Also when short-term actions are needed. For example, the trade war started by Trump and reacted. I think the EU reacted quite well on that, because that was a common voice, you know, and that voice was relatively strong, I felt. And that's a good example. But on the other hand, I'm missing sometimes the EU positioning itself very weakly. For example, when it comes to relations to China. You know, I've been so many times to China. Chinese always tell me, we want to have a strong EU. That's much better for us. I don't know really why, but they feel they want to have strong partners, you know. And it's certainly more easier, I think, to negotiate with China later on, when the EU is very united, you know, and has a common view, and not a single country is having their priorities for trade and things like that, and thinking mostly of themselves. And then also maybe some more positioning, clear positioning when it comes to digitalization, you know, and also the risk side of it, for example, in the labor market, the consequences and things like that. And a little bit more as it could be done probably. But I think Lars said it, that the getting to some kind of convergence of debate also. I think this is very important, and it's still, I don't know how to get there, but it's certainly very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, I think it's very important to make much stronger distinctions than we do with liberalization of the labor market and other markets. If we start to import goods produced by people in the Middle East, they don't come to Sweden and settle down in suburbs where they are getting severe social problems. From a social point of view, immigration of low-skilled workers to Sweden has completely different social consequences than to import products which they have produced in their own countries. Then you get a confrontation between the native population and the immigrants. So I think we are very sloppy there, and that's partly to blame economists who, in very abstract models, have shown that import from low wage countries are substitutes to movement of labor. But then the social consequences completely neglected. And that's where we have the severe problems now, today. The other point is a smaller one. Ireland was mentioned as example of successful convergence. But that was by pursuing policy that was criticized by the other countries, the taxation policies and the favoring of real investment in Ireland. So now you have the case where you have convergence of output, but divergence of inputs.
Well, some comments on that. I think Thomas Sowell usually says that you cannot compare mobility of people and mobility of goods in the same way, which some economists usually do. So that I think very much goes with what Asa Lindbeck said, and also what actually Mr. Jeppsson implied in his first remarks. Should we start there, or would you like to start about with the common convergence of positions, maybe we could call it, for the EU? Maybe we should start with the convergence of positions, because it's a question of policy, isn't it?
I mean, this is a vast subject, all from trade policy to policy versus China and digitalization. But I mean, if you want to put this in a general framework, you could see, I mean, all the divergence in policies around when it comes to protectionism and trade, when it comes to climate, when it comes to resolution of conflicts, then the EU is not doing so badly, I would say. And the last case here, the United Front towards President Trump was very successful in a very balanced manner, I would say, by Cecilia Malmström, where she was fully backed with the member states showing that we were ready to rebalance, but not taking the actions and being prudent. I also think the Brexit process actually, in an ironic way, have strengthened the EU 27, something that was not very clear right after Brexit, where you could think that this would lead to a split instead, and maybe countries following the UK. But here we have seen a very united front, and maybe also a need to be more united. Of course, it helps what then happened in France with Macron. You think the alternative is Le Pen. You don't really think about that right now, but if that had happened, we would have a completely different EU today. So it's also, I mean, a consequence of events that we couldn't foreseen. So I would say the global context, the external world, is strengthening the EU in a number of areas right now, and we also have constellations, even though I hear what Professor Fuest is saying about the German government, but I think we will see with Germany and France, not the UK, it's not taking part any longer in the policy formulation, we will see a drive for more integration and deepening in a number of policy areas.
Thank you. Some remarks on what Professor Lindbeck said?
Yes, I mean, I think you are right in saying that the economists didn't get that one right. I remember the debate in the early 2000s where, among many economists, you know, taking this rather abstract view, the United Kingdom was considered as a model, you know, because they immediately opened up the labor market to Eastern Europe, whereas other countries didn't. And, you know, the economists, including myself, I have to admit, said, you know, the UK way is right. And today, you know, I think we would have a more nuanced view, at least, on this. But, you know, I think there is this it's true, there is this very fundamental contradiction. We, you know, want this mobility of movements. You know, we have the 4 liberties. In the case of Brexit, you know, we pay a high cost, let's not forget that, for insisting. But, you know, the debate there is, you know, could the UK remove one and still stay in the internal market? And you know, economically, you know, it's totally clear that this is the right way to go. You know, it's very costly to say, okay, you know, then we also put limits on trade. Economically, it's wrong.
but the EU wants to preserve these 4 liberties and wants to prevent other countries from saying, okay, if the UK shuts down its borders, Sweden might do that, which is, it's politically understandable. If you want to protect these 4 liberties, it's difficult to let the UK deviate from that. But of course, you cannot have national social policy and free movement of labor. At least, and there are some restrictions. I mean, labor movement isn't totally free within the EU. There are some restrictions, but the question now, I guess, is the EU sustainable?
The speed has to be regulated.
Or at least, regulate the speed. But the question is really, is the EU sustainable? On Monday I was in Prague, and there is an intense debate about leaving the EU in in the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is economically very successful, highly integrated into the European economy. They haven't even let in very many immigrants in the refugee crisis. But this labor mobility and refugee questions, which are 2 separate issues, often brought together, are at the center of this debate as well. So I think here there really is a question of sustainability of the EU with these movements. I don't. Maybe one comment about convergence of views. I've written a paper with a group of French economists and German economists about reform of the Eurozone, and we did that because we were worried by the fact that there is this divergence of views between Germany and France, and even between academics. You would expect, nationality for an academic doesn't play a role, because either something is true or untrue, but it's not German true and French untrue at the same time. And I think we need more of that. It was very helpful to work in this group, and I think we need to work more together and have a very open debate about our divergences as well.
I guess if you can keep 35 people in a room and discussing EU for 90 minutes, we just we are on overtime now with a couple of minutes. The debate is, of course, the discussion is obviously very interesting, but we do have to conclude this, and I would actually let Professor Calmfors conclude it before letting you out in the spring weather of Stockholm, which I think is about 4 Celsius soon.
Short comment to us. I mean, I agree with much of what you said, but we should distinguish between labor mobility and sort of refugee immigration. That the sort of social problems in the suburbs we have seen that's not because of labor mobility within the EU. So that's the refugee immigration that has given cause to that.
It's a difficult distinction. You say that you are asylum seekers, but in fact you might just want to have higher income.
Yeah, but they don't come from other EU countries. So that's a distinction. Yeah, but let me then go on, leave that question, just go back to another one. Common positions, I mean, in foreign policy, in defense policy, trade policy, yes, that's very important. Trade policy works quite well. Foreign policy towards Russia, I mean, there are sort of different positions taken by different countries, some Eastern European countries, Italy. That's very unfortunate. Also defense policy is more a NATO issue, but yes, but I mean that's such a simple thing that defense budgets in percent of GDP differ very much between countries, and there Germany is not exactly leading the way for others. I think that is also very unfortunate. So there's a lot there to work on.
Well, with those convergence of views, of that we need to discuss the EU more, and that we need to discuss other aspects of the Union even more, I would like to close this seminar. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for your questions and for a very interesting debate. I do hope that the Research Institute for Industrial Economics will have more seminars in this. I do also hope that the European Economic Advising Group will write more interesting papers in the future. So thank you so much.